Yo, so welcome to the Spaceless Realms Podcast. And in this podcast, we'll be talking about the year of the dragon and how these planetary energies align for the evolution of humanity, whether you want to be able to devolve and go with the shift or stay in ignorance and go against it. So yeah, welcome, Kalki. Let's talk about the
Yo,
year
it's
of the
an absolute
dragon.
pleasure always. Let's do it because the dragon is the most powerful symbol. It's the most ancient, most powerful, primal,
Hmm.
wild, non-domesticatable symbol in the entire zodiac. Now, very interestingly enough, the Chinese zodiac, the Asiatic zodiac, has been corrupted and domesticated in many different senses. The boar has turned into the pig. The family of the wolves, the wolverines, the coyotes, all that, they turned it into the dog. So they use domesticated some of the ram into the sheep, but they still call it the ram sometimes the sheep, the ox, but they're not talking about the buffalo. But then the dragon and the snake and the monkey has still been domesticated in some senses, but then the dragon, the snake, and the tiger are considered to be three of the most potent signs in the zodiac. But if you pit together in an ultimate fight a dragon versus a snake or a tiger versus a dragon, the dragon would always win. The dragon's the ultimate force. And especially if you consider those aspects of the water dragons, the makaras in Indian tradition, Naga tradition, the dragon people, the Naga people, right? They're Makara people. Makaras, ancient dragons, like the Makaras are the ones that, say, for example, the Jain Tirthankars, the royal bodhisattvas, like Pushpadanta rides on a giant Makara with an army of dolphins. So
Hmm.
the water dragons, like Leviathan, like the ancient dragons underneath the Loch Ness monster, Ogopogo in the West Coast, which you might be familiar with in the Okanagan Valley in Kelowna. There's all kinds of different examples of dragons across cultures, across the ages. Dragon people, the Chitauri in Africa. You've got, like I said, the Nagas in India. You've got Shenlong in Asia. You've got the dragon people. You've got, the strength of the dragon, which the phoenix itself, which is like the fire phoenix, which is like the ultimate dragon in its pure form, which is like a flying dragon. You've got Quetzalcoatl,
Hmm.
Quetzalcoatl, depending on how you pronounce that. You've got Cihuacuatl. You got the twin sister and brother, the shining serpent, the flying dragon that gives praise to the goddess in Aztec and Mayan culture. You've got all kinds of examples across the ages, across traditions of the symbolism, the power of the mythology of the dragon. We talked about the RNA in the brain as well, too, being this primordial reptilian,
Hmm.
uh, you know, mediation principle between the two hemispheres of the brain that represent the battle between good and evil and rational and irrational and male and female and human consciousness, patriarchy and matriarchy. You've got the primordial dragon energy in the middle, which goes all the way down the spine, which is the kundalini energy, which is again the energy of the dragon, the energy of the snake. It goes all the way up the spine. The nine major nerve bundles, there's not seven chakras, there's nine ones in the spine alone, there's 36 in the body, which are usually associated with marmas. That's all dragon energy. Pranayama, prana. The tail itself of the spinal cord, which is actually related to the tail that we have left over as a reptilian remnant of when we used to have reptile or primate tails.
Hmm.
Then you see that the dragon's energy is intimately interconnected with the entire zodiac. And if there's one sign that dominates the zodiac in terms of power, in terms of strength, in terms of creativity, even in astrophysical terms, the dragon is considered to be the emanation of the Sahasrara chakra, which I call Mahaisana, the ultimate point of manifestation of the creative energy. The ultimate chakra, the glory of the intelligence, essentially, is where you go beyond the eighth chakra, which we think is the eighth, but is really about the 10th spinal chakra, the manifestation in etheric form of, like the fontanella, essentially, which is the beginning of the spurting of the creative energy of the dragon, which is in metaphysical terms, they call it the cosmic dragon. They call the same thing as in metaphysical terms. A lot of people don't know there's such a thing as wimps and machos. Wimps, I believe, please don't misquote me on that. I'm just remembering from memory. But the WIMPs correspond to weak imploding massive particles, and the machos are massive, absorbent, compact halo objects or something. So basically, in astrophysical terms, you've got a correlation of the mesocosmic and the macrocosmic. And the macrocosmic, the energy which manifests from the crown, from the Sunyatadara chakra, from the 0 point chakra, where the energy of the earth replenishes our toroidal force field at the base at Muladhara, comes in at Muladhara, goes all the way up to Sahasrara. blossoms into Bahaisana, blossoms into Pasuryaka, into Bahaisana, into all the different levels of the Fontanella blossoming into infinity. And then you have the creative dragon coming out, which you could think of in that symbolic term, one of the most iconic superheroes and greatest martial artists of all time, who's still considered to be the undefeated greatest martial artist of all time, Bruce Lee, enter the dragon. So the dragon is the creative force of the energy of the psychic and artistic energy, which manifests through the crown chakra and manifests reality instantly. Now you can imagine even the shamanic cultures, indigenous cultures across the ages were able to manifest the power of the dragon or of shapeshifting or of the ultimate phoenix, which again, the seed of the soul, the pineal gland represents the phoenix force, which again, in another form of dragon or the birds all being dinosaur descendants, different forms of ancient, dragonic or draconic ancestors. You've got the Paramhansa form of the brain in its full blossoming in, Asamprajnata Samadhi, which is Paramhansa state, which is the great swan, transcending the swan. Hamsa, swan, and Paramhansa, the beyond the swan. It's the swan in full blossoming turns into a blazing phoenix at the crown at the pineal gland, which represents the Ajna chakra and the projection of the full comprehension of the unseen reality of our true sight. So sorry if that's a long, tedious introduction, but I feel like if for those who don't know how intertwined the dragon and the reptilian energies are within our ancient traditions, they go everywhere throughout all traditions.
Yeah, it seems like the more that you learn about symbology and just what you can see within deeper meanings of things, like just like say if you say dragon, then you can stem from so many different sources of knowledge all throughout history just from saying the word dragon. And
Mm-hmm.
you
Yeah, and
mentioned,
again, Draconians, Saurians, Anunnakis, the ancient peoples, the Nephilim, the Anakim, the Rephaim, they were all related to hybridizations of Draconian, Saurian, or Saurian, or it's dinosaur, Saurians, Draco, Dragon. It goes back to the vampiric traditions, which were Draco rulers, which were like they were dragons in human form. Like, for example, Vlad the Impaler being like 7'3" or something and being like this dominant dragon human being hybrid that could impale people, was known to impale his foes with a single blade and impale multiple men on his one giant sword and lift them up into the air. So you can imagine the dragon energy you would need to actually do that. He was probably born under the year of the dragon, but we have no way to determine that based on ancient DNA because it would be too convoluted, it'd be too conflicted in terms of people debating different sources. But I'll bet you anything he was born under the dragon year.
Okay, I have two questions. The first one is talk about the difference between seraphim and nephilims.
Ooh, very, very different, but very interesting because at the end of it, it looks like it's like similar, different case. The Nephilim are considered to be fallen angels, the giants, the remnants of the giants. So I have a track I published recently called Remnants of the Nephilim, which
Mm.
actually quotes one of the science fictional movies recently in which is a prequel to the Alien series that's called Prometheus, that has to do with a race of hybrids, that Nephilim hybrids that are ancient advanced civilizations. The Nephilim, they were known, one of the mistranslations, which is also an accurate translation for, again, kind of like the confusion about the archons being all evil, or some people thinking there's good and evil. That there's reptilian resistance, there's reptilian council, there's Draco councils, there's different, but the Nephilim and the Seraphim, fundamentally completely diametrically opposite beings. Whereas the Nephilim were known as the defilers. They were known as those who were fallen angels who were considered in some cases to have given birth or seeded the men of renown on earth, which gave birth to certain giants and certain beings. If you can imagine like ancient humanoid beings that look like giant humans with very advanced capacities and space travel, who came down and fell in love with the creations of the beings they had helped to hybridize as humankind. They fell in love with the daughters of humans and then created a hybrid race, which were known as the men of renown. The Nephilim were known as fallen angels in many cases. They were known as the defilers because they raped, they killed, they brought war. They were known as, having created and triggered nuclear war on Mars. Then they were known as having come down and corrupted Atlantis and triggered the war between Atlantis and Lemuria. So there's a lot of misconceptions. They're not all bad. But the Nephilim actually relates also to the Mormon concept of the tribe of Ephraim in the 12 tribes, which actually has to do with a prophet that the Mormons worship as Nephi. Now, Nephi was actually part of the Nephilim, and he was one of the defilers. That's why the Mormons have a lot of false prophets. So a lot of people would say that, and then it correlates to indigenous traditions and stories, because if you dig from an indigenous perspective, from a shamanic perspective, the Mormons believe that indigenous people were evil and lost, and that they were worshiping a false creator, and that they should have bowed down to Yahweh and should have accepted their prophets. And they consider them to be the Lamanites because they say they lamented a lot. They were complaining about their fate based on being colonized, and the Mormons were telling them they should convert to Mormonism. Very interestingly enough, if you invert that principle, and in end times in the Bible, they tell you everything is upside down, good becomes evil, evil becomes good. Colonialism is thought of as freedom, and capitalism for some people is thought of as a great wealth, but then everything has been flipped around. So then the Nephilim, or Nephi, as a prophet to the Mormons, was one of the Nephilim leaders. So he was one of the fallen angels who came to teach forbidden secrets of a colonial patriarchal religion that subjugated women and oppressed people into worshiping a voided entity that they knew as Yahweh. And that fits hand in hand with the colonization principle of practically all different branches of Christianity, with a few exceptions like Rastafarianism, Seventh-day Adventists, a couple of rare branches of Orthodoxy, like the Coptics, for example, a number of other ones that stayed secretive and didn't try to proselytize or promulgate their principles to other people. But really, at the end of the day, the Nephilim versus Seraphim. Seraphim is a branch of the 5 main branches of angelic beings, of principalities in the heavens, where they say there's 12 times 12,000 formations of each of them. So there would be 144,000 seraphim in the legions of the heavens, 144,000. So you have the cherubims, which would be the youngest ones. Those would be like the cherubs. Like when you say, oh, he looks like a little cherub, looks like a cherubim. Those are the baby angels. Then you have the seraphim. Like, for example, one of my one of the brethren from White Lotus Society and Dreadnought Army, his name is Seraph Guard. To me, he's the leader of the seraphim. He's the guardian of the seraphim. So he's a hip hop artist as well. I gave a conference on that a while ago, based on the reincarnation, the second incarnation, or the multiple incarnations of prophets in these end times in the midst of hip hop as a movement. So Seraph Guard to me is one of the guardians of the seraphim, or one of the leaders of the seraphim. The seraphim are one of the caste of angelic beings. So like I said, you've got the cherubims, you've got the seraphims, you've got the and then within the seraphim, you have archangelic seraphim, you have angelic seraphim, you have the ones that have 6 wings, the ones that have 4 wings, the ones that have 2 wings. So there's many different denominations of each of them. Usually they're functioning under angelic mathematics. So the legions in the heavens correspond to angelic numbers, multiples of 12 usually. But then in the non-binary spectrum, you have to add another fragment of that, which brings it up to, instead of 144,000, you'd be at 219,000 or 216,000, which would add another half of 144, being the 72,000 non-binary angels. And then you have to calculate the balance of the angels of darkness, the angels of light, the angels of half light, angels that have half and half, like that are, half on the occult side, half on the light side. Not necessarily evil at all, like nothing to do with evil, not fallen angels, but beings of, like, angels of darkness and angels of light. Similarly to how you would think of like angels being African angels versus, or black magic angels versus white magic angels, angels of death versus angels of life. But none of them are meant to be fallen. The Nephilim are considered to be fallen angels, but those different. So the Nephilim aren't considered a branch of angels, but if you consider them, they'd be the 6th branch of angels. They'd be the fallen ones. That would be just as a generalization. Doesn't mean that all of them were fallen, just means that they had that reputation of being defilers. Then again, so okay, you have the cherubim, the seraphim, the dominions, which represent their caste of angels. It's a very abstract caste of angels. That has to do with the dominions. They correspond with certain dominions, like the Dominion of Canada, for example. So they correspond to ancient delineations of countries, and they represent they just like, say, someone like Seraph Guard would stand for all the seraphim and be the guardian of the seraphim. The dominions will be the ones guarding the dominion. Now, at the seat of the dominion, you would have the thrones, which is another subcategory of angels. Now, the thrones represent, if you think of the consciousness of a human being as being like the throne, the seat of the soul, like the pineal gland is like the throne, the dominion would be like the entire etheric body.
Hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean that the thrones are less important, but the thrones dwell within the dominions. The dominions have thrones within them, but then they're both separate entities as well. It's kind of like the mystery of the Trinity. So then we're at four now, and then you have the principalities as well. Principalities are usually smaller than dominions, like for example, Liechtenstein being a principality within Austrian German precincts, but is considered to be a separate, or the Principality of the Vatican. That's a corrupted one, but essentially those are like very small regions that are smaller than provinces, but are considered to be independent in a way that is similar to a country. So, and then within them, again, you would have thrones as well within principalities. So it's complex to explain those ones because they're more abstract, but essentially there's supposed to be five main cases of Gnostic angels, and then there's the metagnostic ones, which are the hidden ones, which would bring it up to seven cases of angels. And then you've got the fallen angels as well, which counterbalance those. But I think at the end of the day, the Tibetans had it best when they describe. I think there's a lot that we've lost over the course of the years. We've lost certain categorizations of certain supernatural beings. We've lost a nomenclature for them. We've lost the accurate number of how many there are in each legion, and we've founded ourselves on principles that have been mistranslated, miscorrupted. But at the end of the day, all of that really does go back. Those beings have the power they have based on the birds all being ancestors of dinosaurs. So again, the Anunnaki, the Elohim, everything else, they all have primordial reptilian or dragon or Draco DNA within them, allowing them to grow wings, to be bird-like, which again, the birds, if you go dig back far enough, they're all dinosaurs. Just like fish, when you dig back far enough, they're all dinosaurs. Humans, not necessarily. Some of them, like for example, colonizing humans, had certain features which were primordially colonial and parasitic or predatory. Those would be colonial people. Those would be like not necessarily all white passing people, but because they had the Chitori in Africa, they had the Nagas were the good ones. And then there's like other ones as well in different traditions that were related to dragon people being either good, greedy, hoarding certain resources, or being evil on the other, being greedy and evil, or being good on the other side, being like Lemurian dragons and protecting people.
Wow, that's amazing. Especially
Mm-hmm.
like how you're talking about how birds are so significant to dinosaurs as well. I
Yeah,
think
very
that that's
much so,
very
because there
interesting.
was a time back in the days where seeing any bird in the sky, they all would have looked like dinosaurs. None of them
Yeah,
would have, most of them didn't even have feathers. They
that's
had like,
crazy.
they had
Mm.
flapping skin, and they would have looked like pterodactyls or, like other, and then none of us would have been like, oh, look at the cute little birdie. You would have been like, oh my God, that's a giant air monster.
Hmm.
And they all,
Wow.
most of them would have been carnivores as well too. So it really goes back down to that. And if you look now, a lot of birds will actually feed off of insects,
Hmm.
which at the end of the day is a form of carnivorous diet. They eat seeds as well too, but so they're omnivores.
Wow. Okay, now I want to talk about how reading like the ancient stories, there's a lot of stories of how gods ride humans. And stemming from that, I want to talk about jinns as well. I want to have a deeper understanding of jinns.
Very good conversation.
Yeah.
Very good conversation. So the gods established kingships, the gods and goddesses, but the goddesses wanted nothing to do with
Mm.
establishing kingship on earth based on patriarchy. But the goddesses were shunned at that time. That's around the time where, Islam appeared in a pre-historical sense. Patriarchy was corrupting and trying to overtake the matriarchy. This is the reason why we hear about the Dogon Empire. We don't hear about the Leonid Empire. We hear about the Kushite Empire, but we hear very little about matriarchal rulers. And we hear about Shaka Zulu, but we don't really hear about the primordial divine feminine warrior heroes. You hear about Nefertiti being very beautiful and very erudite and very knowledgeable, but you don't hear about being a great, political strategist and warrior. They've eradicated the matriarchal side of the history that we've been living since ancient times, because this would bring us to a much more advanced level where decrepit patriarchal fucks siphoning energy as puppets from giant dragon or Draco overlords that are on the evil side of the spectrum. They
Mm.
wouldn't be able to rule if we had our matriarchal memory and traditions brought back to who we are.
Mm.
But so if we dig into that in terms of sorry, please refresh my memory for a second. You were just saying there was two
Yeah.
different points.
Yeah. So I want to talk about how in the ancient stories, there's a lot of stories of how gods were riding humans, and also stemming from that, I want to talk about jinns and just like the concept of jinns and like what a jinn actually is.
That's why I dug into that because of Islam. I
Mm,
was talking about prehistoric Islamic traditions and the oppression of Islamic patriarchy and the inversion of the original matriarchy. So jinns are ancient spirits, which
mm,
they're very much like guardian angels, daemons back in the days. The jinns are considered to be evil in some people's ignorant Islamic perspectives in the mainstream. Some people would think that jinn is automatically an evil spirit, but many people know, and I've had one of my best friends back in the days, Bakr Kader, who taught me, as well as Hussein taught me the same thing. They were from Lebanon, Iraq, and UAE, and they told me he had a story to me that he told me, very specific, detailed story of one of his best friends who married a jinn in another dimension and had children with her. And he would literally tell Bakr when he would come into his house. Bakr told me this story very, very specifically in detail when I was a teenager. And he said he would come into his house when he was like 14, 15, and he would go to sit on what looked like an empty chair. And his friend would say, "Please don't sit there. My child is sitting there." So there's this interconnected reality between, and I've had other friends as well that have told me they've had supernatural relations. I've had supernatural relations in my dreams and other realities with beings from other realms that you could qualify, for lack of a better term, as being jinns, but not like horned jinns or
mm.
demonic looking beings, but spirits from other densities that have transcended or that are future humans or that are in other space-time realms or are more etheric hybridized beings, but they're connected to us through friendship, through intimacy, through tantra, through other different concepts, because they're much more advanced than some of the people that we could meet in this reality. And usually they pick people, the jinns and the gods, again, the gods are the divinities, those beings that choose certain humans as portals, as vessels to enter or to possess or to overtake in order to establish their rule or their dominion on the planet. They choose certain specific beings that have more supernatural qualities, more open mindedness, more awareness, supernatural physical attributes as well, to hyper agility, hyper vigilance, knowledge of the occult, of the metaphysical, who have a natural propensity towards the extrasensory, towards the paranormal, towards the eerie supernatural aspects of reality.
Interesting. And you were saying earlier, like the more that people gain an awareness of their true path and their true past, that takes away power from the the secret governments who are harnessing the power of the primordial dragon in a
It
way.
very much does, because if you
Yeah.
think of the dragons, they're harnessing ancient repositories of knowledge, of energy. Nehesh, which corresponds to snake, which is a form of dragon. Again, it's like an earth dragon, it's a land dragon.
Mm,
Nobody would really argue that snakes aren't Draco-like. A lot of them, like, so you see an anaconda that's a 45-foot snake in the Amazon, you're not going to say that doesn't look like a giant sea dragon. And they
mm,
exist, they're still there. I was just watching a documentary on a 45-foot anaconda in the Amazon, and they said the Amazon wasn't even the most dangerous river. So snakes, dragons, very similar. In Hebrew, in Aramaic, Nehesh actually means wisdom and serpent at the same time. So it
mm,
means snake and
mm,
wisdom. So the Hasidic knowledge of the snake, which is no coincidence that it's related to Hasidic traditions, Judeo-Christian traditions being Hasidic. Now, basic on the opposite side is First Nations. Basic is never a bad thing. It's alkaline. It means it's ital. It's healthy, it's vital, it's good for you, it's basic. Like Buddhism, Eastern philosophies, basic. First Nations, basic. Living in harmony with nature, basic. Hasidic, more complex. Developed societies where they're necessarily talking about other aspects of what they think are metaphysical realities, but at the same time, they're colonizing people and forcing them into an acidic perspective or worldview, which corresponds quite eerily enough with the predatory nature of the snake, poisoning beings with acid, then eating them and swallowing and digesting them. So that's what religions have done colonially to basic peoples. They've eaten them psychically and physically and murdered them and raped them and killed them and colonized them in the name of Hasidic or acidic traditions. Now, a lot of people might think this
mm,
is anti Semitic. I'm part Semitic. I'm Hebraic. I was born part Hebraic. So if people can tolerate having a movie like Borat becoming a giant blockbuster where he's being extremely racist towards Hebraic people, extremely stereotypical, racist towards Tsigani people. I'm a Roma as well. So
mm.
racist towards Holocaust survivors. My descendants on both sides are direct Holocaust survivors and murdered in the Holocaust as well. I'm a residential school survivor. So I have a right to criticize the traditions from which I've emerged. And I'm just saying that, you know this already, but I'm saying that for other people that might be like, hey, what he's saying is anti-Semitic. He's saying Hasidic is acidic, but acid is not always a bad thing. Acid corresponds with wisdom in those traditions. That doesn't mean that
Mm.
the acid is necessarily beneficial for you. Because if you don't have the kind of poison training or resistance to be able to resist or survive the venom of a snake or of a dragon or the fire or the intensity of the wisdom being brought to you, you might die. You might poison yourself. You might burn alive. You might go, into another density. You might be in the throes of death or sickly diseases. So it's really, it's really perspectival, and each perspective is actually individually restructured according to different genetic factors, social factors, political factors, spiritual factors, emotional factors. So it's a very complex reality.
Hmm.
But that being said, that's where the origins of acid and wisdom came from. And basic wisdom is alkaline, is ital, is healthy, is vital.
Hmm.
And that's in harmony with Mother Nature. Acidic wisdom usually has to do with patriarchy and colonization.
Interesting. I've never heard of that comparison before. So it's interesting to gain more knowledge on that. I definitely have to do more research in that area.
Yeah, no, it's
Dang.
wonderful because,
Oh.
like, to be honest, I've come to a lot of those conclusions through Mother Nature, through insects, through plants, through First Peoples, through my correspondence with other beings supernaturally inclined across the planet. But you probably will not find that in any book or any scripture anywhere described the way that I have. It's kind of like the numerology of consciousness. The stuff that I've talked about, this is why I think it's very important for us to do this podcast, because nobody is really talking about these realities.
Exactly.
Nobody's discussed that, to my knowledge, which is very limited as a human being with a conscious capacity is restricted as well. But still, to my knowledge, as a world wisdom literature postdoctoral scholar, I've never heard anyone in my life either talk about these realities.
Dude, it's a very, very rare. And as time progresses forward into the future, it's only going to be more dim. Like the whole conversation that we're talking about, all the topics that we're talking about, it's all going to get too compartmentalized. So people will think that because of how easy it is to get knowledge nowadays, of how easy it is to just like look something up on the internet, people like it just
Yeah,
puts something over their face, like they don't really like deeply understand it.
it's a dangerous rabbit hole because anybody can post anything on the internet these days.
Yeah. Yeah, and also like a lot of people are coming at it in controversy, like where people like say that it's supposed to be a certain way, but then people are arguing with each other. The way that, like in my experience, the way that this knowledge is truly understood is by internalizing it and then pondering on it and just feeling the essence of what knowledge can do to your reality and how knowledge can shift your reality.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like it goes the same way. Like a big shift in my understanding of life in general was, instead of understanding it the way that school taught me how to understand things with just my mind, and then just like for example, like you study for a test and then you do the test and then you just forget about everything that you just learned. But if you learn something with the purity of your heart and just the openness of your mind, and then you let that soak for a while in your essence, then you eventually become that knowledge. You know what
Yes,
I mean?
very
Yeah.
much so. And that's something that is described in Bhagavad Gita. Krishna describes that to Arjuna as being bhakti yoga, but that's like instant transmutation of jnana yoga into bhakti. So once you've studied something with a pure intention, you transmute jnana into bhakti. So you have instant access to all of Akasha. But
Hmm.
then there's karma yoga. There's three different levels of yoga, which corresponds to linear evolution, exponential evolution, and logarithmic evolution, which again corresponds with quantum physical realities, just like the binary, the two different aspects of the binary, which you have the binary male, binary female. Binary female would be like exponential to linear. Linear would be binary male, binary female, exponential, non-binary female, logarithmic, non-binary, non-defined, like gender transitional, gender fluid, that kind of reality, non-binary, non-definable in that spectrum of the infinite evolution of the other genders, which are contained within the third non-binary spectrum, which is an uncompleted 8, those ones correspond to logarithmic evolution, which I didn't even know what logarithmic was before I looked into it and realized that it's like an unreal application of numbers. If exponential was jumping from 3 to 9, for example, then from 9 to 27, which is still a pretty hop. Like if you jumped and you were like, I went from grade 3 to grade 9, then I went from grade 9 to postdoctorate, people would be like, holy shit, you're evolving quickly. That's exponential. That's the divine feminine in pure potential. Now, if you add in logarithmic to that, you add in non-binary, the rainbow spectrum, trans, gender fluid, gender neutral, non-binary, then you have logarithmic, which is literally jumping from like 3 to like 3,000 or 3 to 8,000. It's like, and then the next time you jump from 8,000 to 20 million. So logarithmic is like quantum leaps. Like you're like, you hop like 20 million video games ahead in one play. It's like you've mastered the entire universe and suddenly you're creating planets and you're, generating entire solar systems, but you go from a natural, healthy human life to suddenly transcending to the next realm, dying at a certain age. And then you hop up into a 20 cosmos from here where you're so advanced that you're creating planetary systems and controlling entire systems of new civilizations. And there's books that describe these realities that I'm talking about. But that in particular is one of the rare exceptions that I can say is described in science fiction. That one in particular, one of the ones I mentioned from the same guy who coined the blueprint for the numerology of consciousness in the Encyclopedia of Absolute and Relative Knowledge is Bernard Ferber. So he has a book called We the Gods, and he describes humans evolving from humans to angelic realms, to archangelic realms, to the godly realms, where they become and study, they study to become gods and goddesses. And then they watch over entire planetary systems like ours. So that's massive. Because if you start thinking on that level and you start looking at people around you like supernatural characters and non-player characters, like people that are just like, listen, I don't really know much about reality. I'm going to trust the God and the Christians that I pray to. I know my priest's been molesting children, but it's not me doing that. I'm going to keep bowing down and praying. And I know it's a white Jesus, but I don't really, and I'm eating children, but I stop saying that. I don't think they're children. They're pretty grown. People that are like, non-player characters, they don't have a consciousness. They're basically like expendable characters. So you can't really spend too much time around people like that. Otherwise you stay close-minded. But you know that we live in a world that's rampant with those kind of people. It's rife with people like that. You walk into a corner store, you walk to a grocery store, you're going to see drooling people, overweight people, sick, diseased people that if you saw them in a video game, you saw the exact same people in a video game, you'd be like, zombie. In this society, we have to be like, oh, political correctness. That's just my next door neighbor. Bill happens to be 73 years old and he watches barely legal porn. He probably has some illegal porn on his computer, but we can't prove that. We can't go into his house and invade his house because that's a breach of privacy. And he's a white supremacist and he's probably a KKK carrying member, card carrying member, but we can't really prove that either because he goes to basement reunions once every 3 months with his old creepy fucking white buddies. They're all supremacists, but in this society, it would be illegal to even question Bill on his belief system. So that's how fucked up the society. Colonialism has us in a bind. White supremacist system have us in a bind because they're like, haha, you can't kill anyone, you can't harm anyone, you can't abuse anyone, but we can use that system and justify that evil has a purpose. So we can abuse you and kill and rape and murder and do all this stuff to all of your people, and you can't do anything about it because it just exists. It's a part of nature and it exists everywhere, and you have to accept that. But if you try to do that, we're gonna crack down on you 20 times as hard as we will on those guys that we forgive all the time because evil is just a part of life. But if you start becoming evil, we're going to punish you. Even the idea that doing evil to evil is evil, it's nonsensical. Even in mathematics, a double negative equals a positive. So if somebody was like, I'm a serial murderer, I go and murder African people, and somebody came along and said, like Dexter, oh yeah, I'm a serial murderer of racists like you, and they murdered them, who gets arrested? The guy you can prove is murdering someone. So they might be like, oh, listen, he's murdered 17 people, but he's been exonerated. There were exceptional circumstances. They were never able to prove where the bodies were from the victims. So that white guy over there, he's exonerated. Robert Pickton, I don't know, or like some other some piece of shit. They're like, well, you go murder Robert Pickton, even after you can prove he murdered 58 indigenous women and fed them to his pigs. You murder Robert Picton, you're still getting arrested for murder one. That's how sick our colonial society is.
I have a question for you personally. Where does did an experience happen in your past where you really had to show this knowledge to somebody? Like where is that rooted from? Like everything that you just talked about, where is that rooted from?
You know, it came through my own awareness because I realized nobody was explaining any of this stuff to me.
Hmm.
Nobody, even people who told me about veganism, people who told me about italism, about indigenous traditions, nobody was telling me we're eating raped and tortured children. It's like I had to watch videos on, maybe on, who knows, Instagram, maybe like some ALF, ARM members on Instagram, some Animal Liberation Front, Animal Rights Militia members wearing ski masks, rescuing animals, and then exposing factory farms. I don't know when the first time was that I saw a video of a cow getting raped, or
Hmm.
knowing that those were babies that they were eating. And then all I know is that shifted me drastically. And I was like, why is nobody going out there saying this shit to people?
Exactly,
Why
bro. Yeah.
is nobody going there explaining that this is the greatest genocide in history? And then I found out that there were people like the Avengers that I was looking into today. The
Hmm.
Avengers, like I was saying, I think in a previous podcast, were actually original super sentient Jewish assassins that were murdering
Hmm.
Nazis during the Third Reich and probably during previous Reichs as well.
Hmm.
And they believed that God was never going to serve justice, that the system was never going to serve justice to them for all the murders that had been happening. So they had to take vengeance into their own hands. Now, if I was alive and I believed in reincarnations back then, I believe I would have been an Avenger, and I probably was.
Hmm. Wow.
And
Okay.
that's where the original Thor and Captain America and Black Widow, they weren't originally Avengers, like, from another galaxy flying down with magic hammers and a sacred shield. If you look at it, even Captain America in the original comics is battling the Nazis. He's in the Allied forces, he's battling the Axis of Evil. In the comics back in those days, it was all about battling the Nazis. Nowadays, nobody wants to talk about the Nazis anymore. They make a little bit of historic movies about it here and there, but nobody explains that the Avengers weren't a fucking giant, Viking wielding a hammer